Hey everyone, ready to say hey to a new language adventure?
Today's deep dive is taking us straight to Sweden, just to be clear, we're not here for the meatballs or minimalist furniture.
Buckle up as we unpack the mysteries of the Swedish language.
It's funny how some languages just quietly go about their business, hiding in plain sight.
People toss around a skull, here, attack, there, thinking that's all there is to it.
Right.
But Swedish has a backstory worthy of a saga, let me tell you.
Okay, now that's how you hook a language nerd like me.
Seriously,
Yeah.
I once spent a whole flight, geeking out over verb conjugations.
So don't hold back.
You said we're talking sagas. Are we going full-on Vikings here?
You bet. To understand how Swedish got its groove, we have to rewind all the way back to the Viking Age.
See, Swedish, along with its Scandinavian cousins, Norwegian and Danish, all descended from a language called Old Norse.
Picture Viking longships, epic poems, the works.
Okay, so far we've got rating and rhyming, which honestly already sounds way cooler than my high school language classes.
But how do we go from rough and tumble Vikings to the Swedish we hear today, with its sing-song rhythm and almost melodic quality?
It's a fascinating linguistic journey.
Imagine Old Norse as this mother tongue. Right. Over time, the dialects spoken in different regions started to drift apart.
The ones in Denmark morphed into Danish, and those spoken in the land of the Swedes, well, you guessed it, they eventually evolved into Swedish.
Okay, that tracks. But I'm guessing it wasn't just a smooth, straight line from Old Norse to modern Swedish.
Languages are always picking up new words, new sounds, like souvenirs from their travels, right?
You're absolutely right. It's all about the influences.
Even small changes, like how the Old Norse word for stone, which was stein, shifted to sten in Swedish, demonstrate those tiny steps away from the original language.
And those seemingly insignificant shifts add up over time.
Stain to sten. Got it.
So we're talking subtle shifts in pronunciation, even spelling, as Swedish started forging its own path.
Precisely.
Yeah.
But it goes beyond individual words.
One of the things that makes Swedish sound so distinct is its rhythm, the way they emphasize certain syllables.
It's what linguists call a stress-timed language.
Oh, yeah. When I hear Swedish, it's like every other word gets a little extra oomph.
Like they're speaking with built-in dramatic pauses.
Exactly.
It's like a musical score for their sentences.
Instead of each syllable having roughly the same length, like in English, the time between stressed syllables is more equal, giving it that rhythmic, almost musical flow.
Okay, that makes so much sense. And now every time I hear Swedish, I'm going to be picturing a conductor waving a baton.
Oh, we've gotten a little sidetracked here.
Back to the history lesson.
Oh.
What were some of the other big turning points for the Swedish language after those early shifts away from Old Norse?
Well, you can't talk about the evolution of a language without talking about the forces that shaped it.
And one of the biggest game changers for Swedish, as you might imagine, was the arrival of Christianity.
It makes sense. You've got Latin coming in with the church, religious terms, even the way they wrote things down.
It's like hitting the fast-forward button on linguistic change, isn't it?
Exactly. It's not just a few new words here and there either.
The church was a powerhouse back then.
Right.
Think administration, education, even just the way people recorded things.
Latin's influence went way beyond a sprinkle of religious terms.
Wow. It's amazing how languages become living records of history, huh?
You can practically trace the footsteps of major events just by, looking at the words people were using.
You're absolutely right. And speaking of leaving their mark, we can't forget about the Hanseatic League.
No, I know what you're thinking.
Economics, trade, snooze fest.
Right. Well, I was picturing more ships, but with fancier hats this time. But you've piqued my curiosity.
What's the Hanseatic League got to do with how Swedes ended up speaking?
Think about it.
This powerful merchant guild, they were the movers and shakers of trade in Northern Europe for centuries.
They had their own language, Middle Low German, and guess what?
A wave of those words washed ashore right into the Swedish language.
Okay, give me an example. What kind of linguistic souvenirs did the Hanseatic League leave behind?
Well, take the word handle for trade, for example. Sound familiar?
Right, handle?
Like practically the same as the English handle. I never would have connected those dots.
Exactly.
And it's not just vocabulary, they even influenced some of the Swedish grammar.
These guys were a big deal.
Talk about a lasting legacy. Okay, we've got Viking raids, religion, international trade.
Swedish has definitely seen it all. Any other major players in its evolution before we move on to, what makes it so unique today?
Oh, you are not going to believe this one. Get ready for the printing press.
specifically the publication of Gustav Vasa's Bible in 1541.
And no, this wasn't your average bedtime story.
Okay, intrigued. Gustav Vasa. Now, refresh my memory. Who's this guy again?
Gustav Vasa was basically the king who turned Sweden into a major power. And one of his tactics.
Commissioning a Swedish translation of the Bible.
Ah, okay, I'm seeing it now. A classic like knowledge is power move. Make the holy text accessible to everyday Swedes. Unify the country under a shared language.
Pretty savvy.
You got it. But here's where things get really interesting for our deep dive.
This Bible wasn't just a translation. It was a full-blown power move to standardize written Swedish.
Hold on, you're telling me one book, this power play by Gustav Vasa, shaped how Swedish looks on the page today?
That's kind of mind-blowing.
It was a watershed moment.
This is when we see those tricky little letters, O, and O, become standard in written Swedish.
Before that, let's just say things were a bit all over the place.
Wow, talk about leaving your mark on the world. I can only imagine the uproar those letters caused back then, and even now, they make learning Swedish that much more fun.
Or terrifying.
Yeah.
But standardization wasn't a one-time event, was it?
Societies change, language has to keep up. What happened next?
You're right, language is never truly set in stone, is it?
Fast forward a few centuries, and Swedish goes through another growth spurt as the country experiences industrialization and urbanization in the 19th and 20th centuries.
Oh, I bet. You've got people moving to cities, new ideas swirling around, new ways of life emerging.
And with all that change, you just know language is going to have to adapt. Were there any particularly dramatic shifts during that period?
Buckle up, because the late 1960s brought about the Du-Reformen, the U-Reform. Now, don't let the name fool you. This was more than just a grammar update.
It reflected a seismic social shift happening in Swedish society. Imagine this before the Du-Reformen. Walking into a room in Sweden was like navigating a linguistic minefield.
You couldn't just use one word for you like we do in English.
Right.
Oh, no, you had to size people up, figure out their social standing.
Okay, now that's a concept I can wrap my head around.
I've definitely been in situations where I wasn't sure if I should use someone's first name or their title.
So how did they decide who got the formal you versus the informal one back then?
It was all about deciphering social cues. Age, profession, even whether you'd bumped into them at the market that morning.
It was like a constant game of social chess just to hold a conversation.
Oh, wow, exhausting. Talk about pressure. I can totally see why they called it a reform.
So tell me, how did the Swedes manage to break free from all that formality?
Well, remember those social changes I mentioned?
The 1960s were a time of upheaval, questioning authority, pushing for equality. And people realized that this stiff, formal way of speaking, it just didn't reflect who they were anymore.
So the language itself became a symbol of the old ways, and this U-Reform was like a linguistic revolution.
Was it a smooth transition, or were there some raised eyebrows along the way?
You better believe there were raised eyebrows.
Imagine telling someone they can't address their boss with a formal title anymore.
Right.
It caused quite a stir. But in the end, the informal du prevailed, making Swedish a much more egalitarian language.
Wow, that's fascinating.
Yeah.
It's incredible how a simple pronoun can reveal so much about a culture's values.
And it just goes to show you, language is never really static, is it?
It's always reflecting the world around it, evolving with the times.
Okay, we've covered so much ground already. Vikings, Bibles, pronoun revelations.
But I have a feeling there's still more to uncover about the Swedish language.
You are absolutely right. There's a whole other layer to explore, and that's the incredible diversity of Swedish dialects.
Dialects. Yes. That's what I'm talking about.
Because I've heard whispers that Swedish isn't just one language, it's like a whole family of different sounds, each with its own story to tell.
That's the beauty of it. It's like a linguistic tapestry, woven from different threads of history and culture.
Linguists traditionally divide Swedish into 6 main dialect groups: Norrland, Svealand, Gotland, Götaland, South Swedish, and Finland Swedish.
6 major dialect groups. Wow, I had no idea it was that diverse.
So we're talking differences in pronunciation, grammar, even the words they use.
Give me the rundown.
All of the above. And it's not just subtle differences either.
Some Swedish dialects are so distinct, they're practically their own languages.
Take Älvdalian, for instance. Spoken up in the Dalarna region, it's considered one of the most archaic and unique dialects. Imagine, this dialect has roots that trace all the way back to Old Norse, like a linguistic time capsule.
Älvdalian. That's incredible.
It's like holding a piece of living history. Do you have any other favorite examples of how these dialects differ?
Like what kind of surprises might we hear hopping between regions in Sweden?
Oh, so many.
In some dialects, they still use plural forms of verbs that have vanished from standard Swedish. And then there's that infamous SJ sound.
A sound so unique to Swedish, it leaves language learners tongue-tied.
Okay, you can't just drop a bombshell like the SJ sound and not elaborate.
I've heard legends about this mythical sound, but how would you even describe it?
It's tough.
Imagine a sound that doesn't exist in many other languages.
It's like trying to explain a color no one's ever seen before. It's like a shh sound, but with a little something extra. A certain Swedish flair, you could say.
I can only imagine.
It sounds like one of those sounds that really makes you appreciate the nuances and quirks of different languages. It's like each dialect holds a little piece of history, a unique way of seeing the world.
And it's not just these traditional dialects that are shaping how Swedish is spoken today.
Immigration has also added another layer of complexity, especially in urban areas. Big cities are like melting pots of languages and cultures, right?
Absolutely. It's fascinating how languages blend and borrow from each other, especially in diverse urban environments. What kind of impact has immigration had on the Swedish language?
It's led to the emergence of new varieties of Swedish, often referred to as multi-ethnolects, which blend elements of Swedish with other languages spoken by immigrant communities.
Multi-ethnolects, it sounds like the language equivalent of fusion cuisine. What a fantastic word.
Do you have an example we can unpack a bit further?
Absolutely. A well-known example is Rinkeby Swedish, named after a suburb of Stockholm with a large immigrant population.
It's this vibrant mix of Swedish, drawing influences from Arabic, Turkish, Kurdish, and other languages.
Rinkeby Swedish. I'm adding that to my list of linguistic adventures.
Is it considered its own dialect, or is it more of a constantly evolving way of speaking?
That's the million-dollar question, and honestly, linguists are still debating it.
Some say it's simply a sociolect, a way of speaking linked to a particular group, in this case, young people from immigrant backgrounds.
So, kind of like how slang can vary between different generations or subcultures.
You got it. But here's what makes Rinkeby Swedish so intriguing. Even native Swedish speakers struggle to place it geographically.
They know it's Swedish, but they can't pinpoint where the speaker is from.
That's fascinating. It's challenging the very idea of a dialect being tied to a specific place, wouldn't you say?
It's almost like it represents a whole new chapter in the evolution of the Swedish language.
It really makes you realize that language isn't just about words on a page.
Right.
It's a reflection of a living, breathing culture.
Always changing, always adapting.
Exactly. We started with, like, Vikings on ships and ended up with a whole new way of understanding you.
This deep dive has been quite the journey. Before we started, I thought I knew a bit of Swedish, just the basics, but now it's like I've opened this door to a whole new world.
It's the amazing thing about language, isn't it?
It's not just a way to communicate. It's
Yeah.
a way to connect, to understand different perspectives, to really experience a culture in a deeper way.
So true. It's like having a whole new set of lenses to see the world through.
As we wrap up our Swedish adventure, any final thoughts for our listeners? Something to ponder as they maybe even try out a little hedge or tack out in the wild?
I think the biggest takeaway here is to remember that language is alive.
It's shaped by history, by culture, by every person who speaks it.
So approach every new language you encounter with that same curiosity we've had today.
And you'll be amazed at what you discover.
I love and embrace the linguistic adventure. Well said. A huge tack to you for being our guide on this incredible deep dive into the Swedish language. I don't know about you, but I'm feeling inspired to book a trip and maybe even try my hand at that SJ sound. Until next time, happy exploring, everyone.